Well, we're going to explore the kings of the East today in two sessions. Our agenda in the first section will be to explore just who are these people that we call the ancient Sinites and the rise of China today. And we'll talk a little bit about the energy crisis that is all precipitating. In our second session, we'll explore the rise of India. And we'll also highlight something that's not widely talked about the impending monetary crisis. And having gone through all of that, we'll talk about the bright spot on the horizon. And so, when we study the Battle of Armageddon, it's a four-power conflict in the Bible. The king of the south pushes at the king of the north. Then we apparently have, according to some accounts, the Western Confederacy coming in. And just about the time that the Antichrist with his forces thinks he's got things under control, he trembles because of the kings of the East enter the picture. And we're not going to get into the king of the north and the Western Confederacy issue. Those are good scholars have slightly different views on the details. But the main point is, who are these kings of the East? In Revelation 16, verse 12, it says, "The sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the East might be prepared." That's where we get that phrase. And it goes on to say, "I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet." These are the Holy Trinity that we have introduced in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. "For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty." So that, of course, is the key event. When we go back to Isaiah chapter 49, we find a similar allusion. It says, "Behold, these shall come from far. Lo, these from the north, and these from the west, and these," the ones left, "from the east, from the land of Sinim." Now, who were the Sinites? This word Sinim comes from a root suggesting thorns. Comes from the Greek sine, or the late French Latin sine. The label Sinim derives from Qian, which is the feudal state in China that unified China in the 3rd century BC and built the Great Wall. It is, of all the dynasties, this is the one from which China gets its name. And the Qian boundaries have always embraced the indivisible area of China proper. And of course, it's from that dynasty that the name derives. So we're going to explore China, ancient China, and how it is surprising all of us as to what's going on today. The early religious belief, for more than the past 2,000 years, China has nurtured three religions: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And they justifiably assert that these three have merged into one. And they really are a fabric that has been unified there. And the temples of the three religions form their triad of sages: Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu, who's the founder of Taoism. Now Confucius, let's just take him one at a time, was born in 551 BC. So this would be about the time that Israel was in the Babylonian captivity, just to calibrate a little bit. He was a contemporary of Lao Tzu and Gautama, and the latter being the unwitting founder of Buddhism in India. Confucius' models of virtue are Yao and Shun, the emperors of the so-called legendary period. He was a great reformer and moralist. He became the premier of his state. And in his own life, he demonstrated the principles he taught. It's interesting what you can accomplish if you walk the talk. And he walked his talk, and he's especially known for his pithy, wise proverbs and so on. Taoism is also indigenous to China. Nearly all of the gods regarded by the Chinese as overseeing their material interests originated with this particular sect, Taoism. It's a system of myths, magic, and superstition. Buddhism is something quite different. It entered China in about 67 BC. This was about the time that the Romans were conquering Judea. It's a strange paradox of religious atheism. The adherents admit of no supreme being, but they believe the human soul is subject to endless misfortune and transmigration into different animal or human forms, the only final escape being complete extinction. That's what they're aspiring to. The mind is withdrawn from thought and feeling by ascetic exercise with the goal of nirvana, the negative state of exemption from pain. That's their goal. And Now, strangely enough, these were not the original religions of China. The traditional religious mixtures of ancestral worship, Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism were all preceded, believe it or not, we now know, by biblical monotheism. This comes as a shock to many. Shang-Ti, if you take the symbol for above or heavenly and the symbol for the emperor and you put them together, you have the ideogram of Shang-Ti, the one God. And we have to go back in time now, long before the 1st century BC when Buddhism was introduced, long before the 5th century BC when Taoism and Confucianism made their appearance. We go back an additional 2,000 years, back to the Tower of Babel, where the nations were dispersed. The Sinites, after that dispersion, were the ones that went east, to the Far East. And so they became very geographically isolated by the mountain ranges and vast deserts. And yet they seem to have retained a knowledge, an accurate knowledge of historical events from the beginning of time. And even though that time was spanned by only 3 lifetimes, Adam to Methuselah to Shem. And so, sealed off, they developed their own characteristic culture, which was undisturbed for 2,000 years. And they did apparently retain some of the original influences from their former homeland region of ancient Babel, including a number of things, one of which is their 7-day week. They've had it from the beginning, which itself is provocative. And now, the origin of their language, their pictographic and ideographic language system, these characteristic symbols that we've seen around, seem to have been initiated about 2500 BC. And they kept a record of reigning emperors from the Hasidic dynasty at 2205 BC. And during the first 3 dynasties, the supreme ruler was Shang-Ti. He's a monotheistic form of worship here. He's designated by a few other things, but it's basically the same belief. One of the most venerated manuscripts of ancient China is the Shu King, the Book of History. And its content back about the time of Noah and consists of a number of records of these first 3 dynasties. And embrace the period from the middle of the 24th century BC through about the 7th century BC. How do we know this? Because these documents were found hidden in a wall of Confucius's house that was torn down about 140 BC. That's when they found this highly venerated, now highly venerated documents. He apparently Confucius was a collector of this kind of thing, and he selected those things which he considered the most valuable and compiled what they call their Book of History. And it's the whole foundation of their system, their religious rites, their tactics, their music, their astronomy, and so forth. And it records Emperor Shun in 2230 BC sacrificing to Shang-Ti, who is being identified as the supreme being of the Genesis record. That's their name for it. And so now, their languages, I won't get into all the technicalities, but it's clear when you start looking at the details of their language that it's clear that all these languages there come from the same source. And the phonological correspondences and shared vocabulary considered very, very heavy evidence among those that all the Sino-Tibetan languages derive from a common source, interestingly enough. And it's interesting that the characters in the Chinese language, especially for certain characters for abstractions, only make sense if you know Genesis 3. And I'll show you some examples of that before we're through. And this picture writing of the Chinese language embodies memories of man's earliest days. And during the Qin dynasty, the first governmental standardization of characters was instituted, involved about some 3,000 characters. Imagine an alphabet with 3,000 characters. There are actually dictionaries that have as many as 40,000 recorded, but today they estimate the necessary ones being at less than 4,000. And they have retained their character pretty much from those early standards to this present day. I showed you how you took the one for above an emperor and put that together to get the one that's above the emperor, namely God. If you take an a symbol for vessel, and 8, and a mouth, you have a boat. That seems very reasonable on the one hand, but it certainly echoes Genesis 7, where 8 people were saved on Noah's Ark, if you will, you may recall. And if you take 8 united in the earth and get total and add water, you have the flood. These symbols aren't obvious at first until you start thinking about it. They echo Genesis 3. If you take dust, the breath of a mouth, and alive, that means talk. Add to that walking, and you have the symbol for creating, and so on. There's obviously lots of these. But let's move on to another concept that underlies their culture, and that's the veneration of their ancestors. That derives from their practice of the emperor acting as the high priest in the worship of Shang-Ti. And he was the intercessor between God and man. That seems straightforward enough, but after his death, his spirit was viewed as continuing this service. At first emperors, then later national heroes, and finally family patriarchs were revered as spirit intercessors for the descendants. That's where they've gotten, over the centuries, has developed this ancestor worship manifestation. And this goes long before Confucius. And it's still above all other ties for both families and communities. Now we get to the reign of Qin Shi Huangdi, and he's the one that established China as an empire. He defeated all the other warlords. He integrated China into its approximate geography it is today. And that's where the name China was given. That's not what they call themselves, but that's what foreigners dubbed it, and has stuck, of course. And Xin ascended the throne at the age of 13, about 246 BC. It's about a little after the Septuagint translation. I'm just trying to link it to our biblical chronologies. And within 25 years, he'd conquered all of China's separate warring states, unifying the nation, calling himself thus obviously the first empire. And he's the one that built the Great Wall, and the reason he built it is rather interesting. He built vast roads, vast canal systems. He standardized the style of writing and weights and measures and all of that. And he's also noted for having burned the ancient classics and records and for burying alive over 400 Confucian scholars who opposed his violent reforms. Obviously, Confucius himself was able to secrete one of those that's obviously subsequently been found. And he was a ruthless executioner. He became Taoist and corrupted the worship of Shang-Ti, erecting other altars and so forth. And very extravagant burials. At death, the graves of the mighty were filled with terracotta models of horses, carts, houses, furniture, slaves of the deceased. The most extravagant of these, of course, and it has been discovered, is that of Shi Huangdi, who was buried about 209 BC beneath a mound 500 feet high and 2 miles in circumference. You can visualize that. And buried with him there was a complex of underground passages full of treasures, 10,000 workmen employed in its construction, and then they were entombed with him. That's a nice job appeal, right? The retinue of life-size pottery soldiers and horses guarding the resting emperor exceed 8,000. And building this immense mausoleum began when he first took the throne, continued for 36 years, and utilized 700,000 slave artisans. These are pictures of just parts of it that have been featured in National Geographic and other such media. And the investigations continue in terms of discovering more details of this burial. It's interesting how they had a preoccupation with death just as the Egyptians did. But this was accompanied with a drift towards polytheism, and the Qin dynasty ends and the new Han dynasty follows. 92% of the people in China today consider themselves ethnically descendant from the Hans. And a famous Taoist, Xin Huangdi, influenced the Han emperor to offer the first imperial sacrifices to the additional spurious gods, or Ts, contrary to the teaching of antiquity. And because of his meddling with the ancient rites, the chief of censors accused him of treason, and he was put to death. But his corrupt practices continued on unchanged for more than 1,200 years. It's interesting how often the Bible admonishes not to move the ancient landmarks. And those admonitions in the book of Proverbs and elsewhere have more to do than just boundaries. It has to do with being very cautious in dismissing the traditions of whatever. During the Ming Dynasty, this is more recent, an investigation was carried out regarding the imperial sacrificial system. 2 committees of historians were appointed to delve in the existing ancient records, and they discovered the Taoist-inspired error and the deviation, if you will, from the original rituals of the first 3 dynasties, which were monotheistic, see? And they abolished those practices, returned again to the ritual of Chu, by which the emperor worshipped a solitary heavenly ruler, Shang-Ti. That was their intent, but of course by now these things had been embedded, so the Taoist and Buddhist concepts really corrupted it, and so the original style of rituals of worship were really corrupted, and they never really went back to it. And so the religious worship's been altered, revised, and blurred with the passage of time. There's another group of people that you want to be aware of, the Xiongnu, the archaeological researchers in Central Asia. That's obviously we've moved well west now. Disclosed the ancient seats of culture east of the Caspian and the migrations from what is now Xinjiang and Mongolia. And in the second half of the first millennium, to protect themselves from these people, the Xiongnu, a powerful group of nomadic tribes, which were then occupying the lands in northern China. That's when Jin began to build the Great Wall along their northern frontiers in the late 4th century BC, and to protect themselves from the Xiongnu. And by degrees, the Chinese did drive them, the steppe tribes, northward and beyond the Gobi Desert to the steppes of modern Mongolia. And in this area, by the 3rd century BC, the Xiongnu Empire had been created and included a number of other tribes of southern Siberia, Mongolia, and Manchuria. And by the end of the 1st century AD, we're going much later in history now, and following the uninterrupted wars with China, and all kinds of internal ascension too, the empire split into 2 parts, the northern and the southern. The southern came under the rule of the Chinese emperors, but the northern part of it left their territory in AD 93 and began what was called the Great Raid into the west. And they ruled Central Asia for more than 2 centuries. And during this time they clashed with the Iranian-speaking tribes, and I won't mispronounce all of those tribal names, but they clashed with the ancient Turkish and Ugarian tribes and other people. Some of them even were exterminated, driven out, others were assimilated. But the main language of this conglomeration of tribes was the Turkish tongue. And the Turkic people were historically and linguistically with the Tukwe, which the name given by the Chinese to the nomadic peoples who founded their empire, stretching from Mongolia to the northern frontier of China, from that area all the way west to the Black Sea. And the name that originated from that one of the Khans of the Golden Horde who embraced Islam. All of these were Muslim, by the way. The Xiongnu were Muslim. And the Muslim writers in the 8th century referred to the Great Wall of China as the Sud-Gog-Eg-Magog, which is the ramparts of Gog and Magog. The Muslims refer to Gog and Magog as the Wajid of this is mentioned in the Quran in Surah 21:36. But these descendants of Magog, called by Herodotus by their Greek designation, the Scythians, terrorized the southern steppes of Russia from the 3rd century to the 10th century and are identified as the principal leaders of the ill-fated invasion that will occur of Israel that's prophesied in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So this sort of plugs, if you will, the bridge between the far east of China that we'll be looking at and the Middle East that we watch from a biblical point of view. This is, in a sense, culturally a bridge between them. One of the things you come up to in these ancient writings are the ancient dragon legends. And I decided to get into this a little bit. The Chinese dragon is called Lung, was a majestic mythological beast that dwelt in rivers, lakes, oceans, and it also roamed the skies in their mythology. Generally depicted as 4-legged animals, interestingly enough, with scales, a snake-like body, horns, claws, large demonic eyes, and they were regarded as a source of power, and because of that, they're commonly adopted as imperial emblems on shields and boats and what have you. And the Chinese cosmogonists defined 4 different types The Tianlong, which is the celestial dragon, he guards the heavenly dwellings of the gods in their mythology. The Fuchanglong, which is the dragon of the hidden treasure, and the Tilong, the earth dragon who controls the waterways, and the Shenlong, the spiritual dragon who controls the winds and rain. So there is a whole mythology, just as we know about the Greeks having their mythology, the Chinese have their mythology, all built around these dragons. And both Chinese and Japanese dragons are usually wingless, but were also regarded as being able to change their size at will, even to the point of becoming invisible. Interesting concept. It's interesting to me to notice that they're also referred to as the power of the air, and that's biblically consistent, because there's a powerful reference in Ephesians 2:2. One of the titles of Satan is that he's the prince of the power of the air. And so the dragon of mythology, despite whatever shape it has, was essentially a serpent. Recognize that's a serpent. And four-legged serpent, interestingly enough. The term dragon comes from the Greek drakon, which is used originally for any large serpent, is what the word originally meant. The term dinosaur is derived from the Greek meaning terrible lizard, and it's alluding to its gigantic size. The notion that dinosaurs became extinct millions of years ago, common phrase and among some, doesn't seem to explain their prevalence in medieval legends and Far Eastern legends throughout early and middle history. And in the Middle East, the serpent or dragon, of course, was a symbol of evil. The Egyptian god Epepi was a great serpent of the world of darkness. The Chaldean dragon, Tiamat, had 4 legs and a scaly body and wings. You see a commonality among these different traditions or perceptions. The Greeks and the Romans also conceived the dragons as beneficent powers dwelling in the inner parts of the earth. And so their protective and terror-inspiring qualities led to their adaptation as warlike emblems, of course, on shields and prows of ships and so forth. But there may be more behind these ancient legends than most of us might suspect. In Genesis chapter 1, we read, of course, that God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that was good. The term translated whales in our King James Bible is the Hebrew word tanin, which is translated whales. In other places it is translated dragons 21 times. Only 3 times is translated whales, 21 times is translated dragons, 3 times serpent, and once as a sea monster. And in a number of, obviously there's a lot of places. In the book of Job we find something rather strange in a passage describing a dozen different representative animals. We find more space, 44 verses to be exact, devoted to 2 animals that apparently are supposed to be extinct these days. One of these was a huge land animal called a behemoth, and that was also extremely powerful. The largest of the land animals, impossible to capture, and fanciful attempts to identify them are ludicrous, actually. The behemoth, huge land animal, extremely powerful, largest of all the land animals, and impossible to capture. And you read all kinds of commentators that try to identify some currently known animal with this, and those examples are ludicrous. It's clear they don't fit at all. And the other animal that is detailed in Job is translated the Leviathan. One is in chapter 40, the other one's in chapter 41. God also describes this sea dragon as apparently a fire-breathing monster with a hide that could not be pierced with a sword, spears, or hooks. That's the point that's made there in the scripture, interestingly enough. Fire-breathing. That's in the Bible. That's not just in the Chinese legends. That's kind of interesting. And because there are many legends about the fire-breathing characteristics, even in medieval literature also. And it's interesting that some dinosaur fossils which have been excavated show a strange protuberance with an internal cavity in the top of the head. And it's just speculation, but it's caused many to wonder if that wasn't, when it was in the flesh, a mixing chamber for combustible gases that would ignite when exhaled in the mixed with outside oxygen. And that's not fanciful. There is an example of that in nature today, the famed bombardier beetle. And this strange creature has some very unusual facilities to protect himself. You take a hydroquinine, hydrogen peroxide, and if they're not handled properly, they're explosive, especially when mixed together. But this beetle has the ability to mix the one with a preservative to keep it safe, and then when they're mixed together, an oxidizing agent which causes an explosion, and it can expel that to intimidate and frighten off his adversaries. And so the famous bombardier beetle. This is an example of rather complicated chemistry that's intrinsic to the beetle, and the speculation by some is that a similar kind of chemistry might indeed have been in certain ones of what we call dinosaurs today. Okay, so it's interesting that the survival of these dragon-like creatures in the post-flood world would also account for the many dragon stories embellished throughout the centuries. And there are some scientists that believe that some dinosaurs may have survived into and maybe even beyond the Middle Ages. And so there's a land-based behemoth in Job 40. There's a sea-based leviathan in Job 41. In New Zealand, or outside New Zealand, in 1977, a Japanese fishing boat caught 900 feet down, brought this thing up, 32 feet long, weighed about 4,000 pounds. They did take some pictures of it. Unfortunately, the shipping boat was not big enough to hang on to it. So they took their pictures and let this grotesque thing go. It's a well-known incident. Now, the ultimate dragon we should all be sensitive to, as long as we're talking on this as a little diversion here, is the ultimate dragon is the Nachash, the shining one of Genesis 3. And here we encounter that the anointed cherub that was rendered as a serpent as a result of the curse in Genesis 3. And it's interesting that the passage describing the Leviathan in Job also goes beyond its denotative zoological significance and apparently alludes metaphorically to him as a malevolent evil spirit, maybe Satan himself. In fact, he beholdeth all high things. He's the king of all the children of pride. Well, we have a good guess as to who that's alluding to. Who is the king of all the children of pride? That's pretty well identified in the scripture. And of course, this secondary illusion technique that may be going on there is repeatedly employed to describe the background and career of Satan in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, that I'm sure is familiar to you. And he, of course, is indeed the father of the children of pride. And even in the book of Revelation, the primary reference to Satan is as the red dragon, interestingly enough. It's interesting that the two final beasts in Revelation 13, one comes out of the land and one comes out of the sea. Analogous at least, to the behemoth and the Leviathan of Job 40 and 41. So you can check it out. In Isaiah 27:1, in that day the Lord with his sword and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing servant, even Leviathan, the crooked servant, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea, and it goes on. So you can check that out. It's a worthwhile research project. But in the meantime, let's get back to history of China. We brought up to about 200 AD with the Qin dynasty. From then to 1911 is sometimes called the imperial period, the Han dynasty. Then there's a period of disunion where it broke apart, various warlords took over. But then approaching the 7th century, there was a reunification in the Sui dynasty. It was in the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907 AD that it reached its peak as a imperial China, the Tang dynasty, followed by the Song dynasty, and then the Mongols took over. These were the first foreigners to successfully conquer and subdue the Chinese, the Mongol Huan dynasty, followed by the Ming dynasty, which recovered, but then the Manchus took over. That brings you to 1911, which begins the national, that's when they created the republic, if you will. And in the meantime, in the middle of the 19th century, we have what are called the Opium Wars. There were two of them. China attempted to halt the illegal importation of opium by British merchants. And two wars were fought over that, and China was defeated in both of them. Britain defeated China in the Opium Wars and forced China to create coastal treaty ports and commercial privileges. And that was their great claim to fame. But by the time you get to 1911, that was finally they revolted against what they viewed as foreign encroachment, and Qing, which was they were finally overthrown by the Chinese nationalists. And then there was some more warlords. There was the invasion by Japan. It was finally, and then a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The nationalists actually established the nationalist regime in 1928, but in 1949, the Chinese communists finally won the Civil War and established the People's Republic of China on the mainland. That's as it endures to this day. The Kuomintang fled to the island of Taiwan to establish their own nationalistic government, and they, of course, continue to this day. China, People's Republic, regards them as a tributary of theirs, and that showdown will take place somewhere along the way here. And of course, I won't go through all the diplomatic history here. It doesn't serve our purpose immediately, but 1966 through 76, that decade is China's Cultural Revolution, and it ends with the death of Chairman Mao in 76. Hong Kong, which was under treaty to the British, was transferred back to China under an agreement in 1997. That was as scheduled and as expected. 92% of the population of China are ethnically identify themselves as Han, and derives from the citizens of the Han Dynasty way back there, about the time of Christ, give or take. And it was a period of great unity in China. And the interior region of China, about 60% of China's present land area, remained largely settled by the Han until the mid-20th century. So a lot of what we know as China is relatively recent. They had a written language. Their spoken dialects are virtually unintelligible outside the region in which they're spoken. There's dozens of them, and even though the languages are technically the same, they can't understand each other in spoken form. But they do share a common written form. And that written language existed for more than 3,000 years, standardized for more than 2,000 years. And one of the most ambitious efforts by the Chinese communists since 1949 has been the modification of the Chinese language to try to simplify it and make it more effective. And so they declared a dialect of a common spoken language and moved that direction. But they've also made an effort to simplify the written language, simplifying some of the tradition characters with fewer strokes, sort of a type of shorthand. In 1949, the literacy rate was estimated to be about 20%. In 2003, China's literacy rate has reached over 86%. I haven't checked, but I think that's larger than the United States. Now, China's population is about 1.3 billion. That's, call it 5 times the size of the United States in population. Its economy is the second largest in the world now. It's ahead of Japan and Germany, was so in 1990. China is growing 7% faster, not in total, faster than the U.S. You figure the U.S. is somewhere between 2 and 3%. China is 7% on top of that, 9.5% last year. China contains 22% of the world's population on 7% of the landmass. The arable land resources are declining at the rate of over 700,000 acres a year due to erosion and other factors, urbanization and so on. So strange enough, this agricultural country is losing adequate arable land as another one of its challenges. Now, the ultimate targets of acquisition include, of course, the Russians' Far East, Siberia, Central Asia, and, of course, continuing assertiveness in the South China Sea. That's something we don't watch much, but is very critical to them. Now, their increase in energy needs are going to affect every one of our lives. They're the largest user of oil outside the United States. Their energy needs have risen by more than 50% just in this decade, and they're likely to accelerate in years ahead. The demand could exceed 3 times their current production, and they, of course, will accelerate as the population gains disposable income. That will accelerate the oil demand. And one of the things they've also done, they've legalized the private ownership of gold. And that also will affect all of us in some very interesting ways I'll get to later. 1.3 billion people, 1/5 of the world's population. They're all becoming more urban. They were less than 13% urban in 1950. They're now over 60%, or excuse me, over 40, approximately 40%. They projected to be going over 60%, and probably a lot faster. See, China adopted a one-child policy back in 1981 that included forced abortions, sterilizations, IUD insertions, and so forth. That caused a slowing of the population growth. That also caused a gender imbalance, and that's something that they are probably going to live to regret because of India breathing on their neck. We'll come to that in the next session. They're very well known for their disdain of what we consider human rights, arbitrary, unlawful deprivation of life, disappearance of individuals, torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatments, arbitrary arrest or detention, denial of fair public trial, arbitrary interference with privacy, family, home content. These things that we value in the West are foreign to their thinking. It's one of the things one of the main differences of perspective between the West and the Far East. Restriction of the freedom of speech or press, restriction of freedom of peaceful assembly, restriction of freedom of religion, restriction of movement in country and foreign travel. These are all issues that we take for granted to some extent and are denied there. And human trafficking. These are things that concern many of us in the West. Now, one of the things we should recognize that China has a technology heritage most of us may not appreciate. They had at one time the world's most advanced civilization. They're responsible for such innovations as paper, printing, gunpowder. The gunpowder is what created the nation states in Europe, the economy of scale and violence. They invented porcelain, silk. They invented the compass. These were radical innovations that altered the planet Earth in many ways. All these originated in China, and from there were spread to other parts of the world. So it shouldn't surprise us that they are now emerging as the technology manufacturer of choice on the world scene, over the U.S. and certainly over Mexico, Thailand, Singapore, and so forth. They produce more engineers per year than the United States does. Their R&D expenditures are way outpacing the United States. Their technology industry outpaces the U.S., the EU, and Japan. They're setting the standards in office software, operating systems, mobile phones, RFID, internet protocols, and other technologies. We'll talk more about that in the next session. They produce 25% of the total world output, over 50% of the total foreign exchange. They have a savings rate between 30 and 45%. In the United States, we have a savings rate of zero, literally zero. We depend on the appreciation of our real estate as our only savings, and we're in for some brutal surprises. They enjoy $50 billion per year in the inflow of capital from us. We send them over $150 million per day. Per day. They've attracted more foreign investment in 5 years than Japan has in the 50 years following World War II. Now, the economic liberalization policies quadrupled the gross domestic product between 78 and 98. In those 20 years, previously agricultural was the leading occupation for over 50% of the population. The yuan's fixed exchange rate to the dollar undervalues its currency by as much as 40%. And I'll explain the implications of this before we're through here. They make the Chinese exports appear artificially cheap, giving its manufacturers what many people regard as an unfair advantage. There's some reasons for that. They're adopting that policy to maintain full employment. They're going to move from the farms to the cities 300 million people. That's more than the population of the United States. Their dilemma is how to keep them employed. The way they keep them employed is to let them make goods that they can sell in the foreign market below cost, below our cost anyway. And the way they keep that going is by lending the foreign countries the money to buy their goods. So they end up converting that labor pool into debt instruments. Very clever, actually. Now, the accession to the World Trade Organization is now adding over $40 billion a year to China's economy. They're recycling their $100 billion plus trade surplus with the U.S. in dollars by buying our treasury bonds. 50% of the U.S. treasury bonds are now owned in Asia, most of them in China. Investors in Japan, China, and South Korea, three of the big holders of U.S. debt, virtually $1 trillion in Treasury notes at the end of January. So they're our creditor. We're their debtor, and growing. In 2005, the real GDP growth in China, gross domestic product in China, was 9.5%. Their central bank cut its currency reserves held in dollars and raised its holdings of euros, and that's going to continue. In 2003, 82% were in dollars, the rest were in euros. In 2004, only dropped down to 76%, and the world's second largest. And they've announced it's going to be going down. Now, meanwhile, the cooperation between China and Russia is continuing to grow. They fundamentally should be adversaries because they have an undefendable border between China and Russia, and they have some problems, but they've decided to yoke together. The total value of their cooperation is over $20 billion in 2004. A bilateral trade goal is to make it between 60 and 80 billion, to have it increase by a factor of 4. And their investment in Russia to reach 12 billion by 2020. And of course, while all this is going on, their military right is growing exponentially. Much of the growth is in the area of maritime strength and aircraft attack, very mobile concept. That's why SINC-PAC keeps a close eye on this. China will become the world's second most powerful military giant, according to most experts, and they are busy studying. We've translated 600 documents from 200 different authors for the CIA has, and it's clear they're studying diligently how to defeat the U.S. in a war they believe is inevitable. I had a chance to talk to Marshal Pillsbury when he's the one that testified before Congress to these effects. Their missile capability, the CSS-4, is their big one. It now has developed improved accuracy, range, and multiple warheads, thanks to compromising virtually all of our black programs. There are 18 presently at the ready. 13 are targeted U.S. cities. The other 5, we assume, are targeted closer to closer countries like Russia. There are over 100 of these projected by the year 2015. Now, why would there be war? Because there's lots of reasons. One is an exploding population. The other one is the numerous island disputes that are throughout Asia. The Spratly Islands is a big deal. The other disputes, of course, North, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. The Taiwan thing is something to keep an eye on. There are 80,000 troops deployed in the province of Fujian, which is opposite Taiwan. There's 260,000 positioned for immediate transport, 13 mainland airfields in less than 250 miles from Taiwan, 1,200 fighters, and so forth. And twice now, China has threatened to nuke Los Angeles if we meddle. We need to understand that. The very fact that they can make that threat itself is interesting. Now, Russia is watching all this with some apprehension. They're facing an economy 10 times their size, a population 4 times as large as theirs, a land frontier that's impossible to defend, and China has 25 million surplus immigrants a year. We get upset with Mexico shipping us 4,000 a day across that border. You can imagine how Russia feels about China, their border as an escape valve here. Now, Russia's Pacific Force consists of, say, something less than 20 ground divisions. That's down from where it used to be. 400 aircraft, 40 combat service vessels, down from 80, and less than 20 submarines. China, in contrast, has literally 4 times the ground divisions. They have 7 times the aircraft. They have virtually twice the combat service vessels, and they have probably about 3 times the submarines. Russia has a 20 front down from what used to have 35, but China is boasting about 60 of them. Now, they're not nukes. Some of them are, a few of them are, but most of them are older technologies, but they also have advanced technologies coming. And of course, in 1999, NATO redefined itself as a global police force. The response to that was the Shanghai Pact between Russia, China, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. These are not almost, but not quite all, of Central Asia joined in. And the specific objective of the Shanghai Pact was to resist the hegemony, what they call the hegemony of the United States. And they actually pool resources. They actually play war games together in which the U.S. is the presumed adversary. So there's Russia, there's China, And they're the other, that's virtually almost all the Central Asia. They're the ones that are signatories of the Shanghai Pact and that practice. Now the Spratly Islands I mentioned, they link the Pacific Ocean with the Indian Ocean. Almost all additional Asian oil demand will be imported from the Middle East and Africa and will pass through the strategic Strait of Malacca in the South China Sea. And it's one of the world's busiest shipping areas. Over half the world's merchant fleet by tonnage sails through the South China Sea every year. So this is a very strategic location. China is big on strategic locations. They've taken over the Panama Canal in the Western Hemisphere and have bases all through the Caribbean. This is also on their agenda. There are other disputed areas too. Indonesia's ownership of the gas-rich Natuna Island group was disputed until China released an official map indicating that the Natunas were in Chinese claimed waters. So that's going to get exciting. The Philippines' primary natural gas and condensate fields are in Chinese claimed waters. Many of Malaysia's natural gas fields are located offshore Sarawak, which also fall in Chinese claims. So Chinese claims these islands in effect. And Vietnam and China have just overlapping claims to the undeveloped blocks off the Vietnamese coast. And so there's a number of these oil fields and things that are crucial strategic places that China claims as theirs. And the maritime boundaries in the gas-rich Gulf of Thailand, portion of the South China, have not been clearly defined. And there's a number of companies that have signed exploration agreements but have been unable to drill because of the disputes between Cambodia and Thailand. And of course, in our world, we have the Panama Canal, which the Chinese now control both ends. There are all kinds of bases throughout the Caribbean. Twice now, a senior official in China has threatened to nuke Los Angeles if we interfere over Taiwan. And China is increasingly involving itself in the Middle East because they desperately need Middle Eastern oil. Energy is the key to all of this. Back in 1956, a geologist by the name of M. King Hubert predicted that the U.S. oil production would peak in the early 70s. People in the industry and outside laughed him to scorn. They were highly controversial, but it turned out he proved to be correct. So they've applied his same methodology to the whole world, and the peak year for global oil production is now estimated to be between 2004 and 2008. So we're essentially there. And this is not fringe material. This is published in Nature, Science, Scientific American, and of course the industry journals. Hubert's peak. Depending on what you take in terms of estimates, the peak comes out the same essentially. The peak will be somewhere between 2000 and 2005. 2008 is usually the assertion. But so after this peak, in other words, and we think we're there, the world's oil production will fall, never to rise again. We may discover new fields, but not at the rate that will offset the fields that are decaying. So yes, there'll be new fields, but they won't be enough to replace the ones that are depleted. That's the point, to give you a simple perspective. We're not going to run out of energy, but alternate energy that we need won't really be available on a large scale for at least a decade. So there's a 10-year window in here where we're in a real crisis. And subsequent costs, of course, will precipitate a number of other derivative crises because of that. I'll show you. America is the world's biggest oil importer, twice that of the number 2, which is Germany. The European Union approximately equal to us, the Union as a whole. And of course, the price sensitivity of oil affects not just oil and transportation, it affects everything else because everything else is shipped. So lots of second and third level effects here. So a crisis is inevitable from our near term out to probably 2015. Now growth in the Asian demand, more than is visible, which is highly likely, will accelerate this estimate. So China's energy independence is over. They were an oil exporter in the previous decade. They need over 5 million barrels per day. We consume about 20 millions per day in the U.S. China imports about 60% of its oil from the Middle East. In 2030, it's expected that their imports will account for 85% of what they need. So that's the same tale for all of us major oil users is that we're all seeing us project needs that are far greater than the supply can support. And that's why China is going all through the Middle East and doing deals, arms for oil alliances throughout the Middle East. So they're surpassing Japan for the first time. They are the major player on the world oil markets. 40% of the world oil demand growth over the past 4 years. And we could get into the numbers, but it tells us basically the same tale. Coal makes up the bulk of China's energy needs, and 65% of their energy consumption. They're the largest consumer and producer of coal in the world. And so during the 70s and 80s, China was a net oil exporter, but it became a net oil importer in '93 and is increasingly dependent on foreign oil. They import about 32% of their oil, expected to double the need for imported oil between now and 2010, and become the world's second largest oil consumer. And a report by the IEA predicted that by 2030, Chinese oil imports will equal imports by the U.S. today. So if you look at their production of China, and you look at their consumption, it's obvious that they now have a shortfall that they've got to buy elsewhere. And electricity demand outstripped the planners' estimates by 3 to 1. And we go through all the numbers. There's a lot of different groups that are trying to make projections, but all the projections have proven to be less than reality brought forth. So China's growing dependence on oil has caused it to acquire interests in Kazakhstan, Russia, Venezuela, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, Peru, and Azerbaijan, to name a few. They've tried to diversify their sources, but China's become increasingly dependent on Middle Eastern oil. It's about 58% today. By 2015, it'll be over 70%. So there's going to be a major contest in the Middle East, and not just between China and the U.S., but between China and Europe. Europe's even bigger trouble than we are. So now just take a look at our consumption. As one measure of consumption here, advertising has increased 400% in 6 decades. Travel accounts for 50% of world oil consumption. From 48 to 72, there's been a 500% increase in oil consumption, 11% per year, doubling every 6.5 years. We presently import 55% of our needs, but it's going to be over 70% by 2025, according to the Department of Energy, probably a lot higher. Russia today is the world's top oil exporter. That may surprise many. You thought it was Saudi Arabia. They rely heavily on oil revenues. They're Europe's most important source of oil and natural gas, interestingly enough, and this dependence is growing. Germany is deactivating 19 nuclear power stations by 2021 for some strange reason. Reserves are ample, but they're highly price sensitive. And the most important export route goes through Turkey, and Russian Caspian ships go through the Dardanelles. Turkey only allows them to do that during the day. They deny passage at night for security reasons. But so we can go through all the numbers, but it's pretty clear that the Middle East is the big gorilla on the block. 65% of the world's oil supply. And the Middle East production cost is lowest in the world, at less than 20 cents a barrel. Israel, of course, has none of significance. There's something else we've talked about in terms of Saudi Arabia. There's a missile base with 120 CSS-2s, 12 launchers, 3 nuclear warheads each at El Saliel, installed by 40,000 Chinese engineers and technicians. What most people don't realize, they don't even know it's there, but people who know it's there don't realize it's under Chinese control. The Chinese have done it for the Saudi Arabians, but the Chinese still control the button. I think that's kind of interesting. Well, in our next session, we'll go from China to India, a very, very different rival, if you will, and we'll talk a little bit about Pakistan. These are 2 nuclear powers that most people don't talk much about, and we'll do that in the next session.